an introduction here. All right, so we're really happy to have Robert Bowling with us. He's currently a vice president, creative director of Humble Bundle, which we all know fairly well. And he's also been excessive. He's also been a huge part of the Call of Duty series, and among other things, which we're really excited to hear about your thoughts and opinions and advice, any input. So we'll save Q&A till like halfway through. So we'll let Robert start now.
Great. Yep. So I appreciate being invited to present at the Game Jam. I think we'll probably break it down to about an hour, 30 minutes of me talking roughly, and 30 minutes of Q&A, because I think that's the most valuable, and I might end a little early to get to that. But essentially, I really want to focus everything about what you're about to embark on in 48 hours. It's my understanding that many of you are familiar with making your own games, doing indie game development, so the whole process isn't foreign to you. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about things that I've learned. At my studio that I had in LA, we had about 55 full-time developers there. And we did a thing every other Friday called Incubation Fridays, which were basically mini game jams every other Friday throughout the entire year. And it's something that I think is extremely important to the process, right? As you get later on in your career, you're going to get into much larger projects that have, 2 to 4 year development cycles. And those become challenging in their own way, because doing a game for 2 years, staying passionate about it and keeping it fresh, and just doing the hard part, which is finishing a game over that course of time, comes with a lot more challenges than a 48-hour game jam does. And that has its own challenges of you don't have enough time to do everything you want to do. And that's really what I want to focus on, is the concept of not necessarily doing everything you think you want to do. And the most important thing that you can be doing right now as you're about to kick off this game jam is, one, identifying who are the vision leaders of this project, right? Like, it might be one person, it might be multiple people. I typically like to combine my efforts, which are more on the creative side, with a programmer who is, gonna be the visionary leader on the code side, and basically be the yin to the yang, right? You need that visionary who's gonna do the blue sky, who's gonna come up with features that aren't feasible in the scope or time, that are never gonna happen. And then you need the other guy or girl, the other developer, who's really focused on making that realistic, right? Because your two important things here in the next 48 hours are identifying, okay, what are my A-class features, what are my B-class features, and what are my C-class features? And how I really define that in my head, that's your game, right? A-class features is, if I have to ship in 48 hours, which you do, if I have to ship in 48 hours, am I proud and happy with what is going out the door from a user experience, from capturing the vision? And then your B-class features that's really fleshing out the other features, right? Like, A is the core gameplay loop and mechanics, and then B is like, okay, we've now improved upon the core, and then C is everything. Right? C is the stuff that if it ends up on the cutting room floor, that's okay, you're fine, because that is probably your post-launch support. That's the stuff you're going to be working on every month after you ship the game, to keep it fresh for at least a year, right? Or forever if you're making a game as a service. And it's really important to have that conversation with everybody on your team, right? I like to do it as a group. Really nail down those buckets of A, B, and C features as soon as possible. And in 48 hours, you're probably going to be doing that in the first hour of figuring out, like, okay, what is the core gameplay loop we're trying to achieve, or core narrative hook that we're trying to deliver, and how can we get that with the minimum amount of features? And then once we've achieved that, or at least understand logistically how we're going to achieve that in the time we have, now how can we polish that and optimize it and get it better? And then it goes into, the actual act of production. And the important thing to remember here is, like, coming up with a good ideal is hard enough, but executing on a good ideal is nearly impossible. And that is what makes game development so special. Is you need, a handful to 100 people all working in sync with each other to execute on this one vision. And that's why having that, whoever that project lead is, needs to be the strongest part of being the filter for all of that, right? Because everybody's going to have a good ideal, right? And you should be open to ideals from everybody on your team, regardless of what their discipline is, right? Doesn't matter if it's coming from animation or programming or design or QA or whatever it is. There's going to be a lot of good ideals that bubble up, and you need to be open to all of them. But just as much as you're open to all of them, someone needs to be that filter that kills an ideal. And that's what makes the difference between a good game and a great game, is someone is killing really good ideas. And it's very important, because just because it's good, just because it's fun, like I said, that it's right for your, to know it's right. Who's the project lead? Who started the nugget, right? There are a lot of things that can be designed by committee. There are a lot more things that should never be designed by committee. And you always need that point where someone needs to say, yes, that's a really good idea, but no, it's not going in the game because of these reasons, right? Because they're the person who has the full context of everything you're doing and why you're doing it. Because otherwise, you're going to get to this and not enough features finished. Not enough features polished to a state that you're happy with, right? And I would much rather make and play a very small, fine-tuned experience than this massive heap of a mess that is just like a little nuggets of ideas and nothing actually got to its full potential. And I think that's what is so special about game jams, is it gives you that opportunity to exercise that muscle that you may not get to do in normal game development, because you're like, oh, I have 2 years at, launch days forever away. I can spend 6 months noodling on this thing that you shouldn't be noodling on anymore. Where in 48 hours in a game jam, you really need to be diligent with yourself and say, like, I don't have the hours to focus on making fishing really good in this open world game I'm trying to make, because fishing, nobody even asked for fishing. Fishing is just something I thought would be cool because I played it Ocarina of Time, and I thought it was awesome. When really your core gameplay mechanics is all combat focused, or your core really advise you figure out who that vision leader is. And really the vision leader, his core job, besides being that filter, that project lead, is really being the motivator, right? Like, people think the higher you get on a dev team or in a company, the less work you're doing in the trenches, which may be true, but basically what your role becomes is shifting from being the guy who hands-on coding, hands-on modeling, hands-on doing all the development, and more being the guy who's putting out fires and allowing the guys in the trenches to focus on just what they're doing, right? Because the best teams work when a programmer doesn't have to worry about anything except the code that he's writing, or an animator doesn't have to worry about anything. He knows that he can do his job and then hand it off to the guy next to him who's going to take it and run with it, right? And the fun of indie game development is you get to be multiple people at once, right? Like, the animator gets to rig everything and maybe even do some modeling or do whatever skill set he's interested in. and that's the fun part, right? Is figure out, like, where is everyone's skill set and how do they work well together, and where can we complement? Because in a game jam or any development, some of you, I don't know the games that you're making, but some of you might be making it solo, it might be a two-man team, in which case communication should be a lot easier. So yeah, is there a specific topic that we may want to dive into or examine? Because I could talk a long time about a lot of stuff, but I really want it to be the most useful information.
I think Robert, one thing is that turning down ideas I mean, there's going to be a lot of good ideas. When do you start, throwing away ideas, and how do you do it gracefully? What's the best way to handle taking all the ideas until you actually get like you said, breaking out the features, getting into nailing down this kind of this first hook or the gameplay loop? I mean, how many ideas should be on the board? We can talk about blue sky and things, but this in particular is 48 hours, which of course is a little bit different, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, when should they stop? When should they stop and just say, this idea is good enough, we should go here?
There's no magical answer. It boils down to, you figure out what your development cycle is, whether it's in 48 hours or 6 months or 2 years, and then you slot out how much time you need for each thing, right? Like, okay, how much time do we need to get the prototype where we can actually be playing something, and giving feedback and critiquing it? So the process of killing an idea comes from the process of prioritization, right? So you start off with, let me prioritize every single idea, right? Because you'll have a short window of blue skying and prototyping where you can put everything on the board, right? And really, you're going to tell right then, as people are throwing around ideas, what is getting everybody in your group excited? What are you guys latching on to? What makes the most sense to you out of the gate? And that's going to decide when it falls into the A features, the B features, or the C features. Now, typically, putting something in the C feature is the act of killing it. You just haven't told it yet, right? Like, you're putting it there, and you're like, everyone's like, yeah, that would be nice to have, but either, like, it's a really good idea, but the scope is so large because it's dependent on, like, 4 or 5 other features. Or it's just it's just not the right idea, but you put it up there because that might inspire something else that leads to a B or an A feature. So you never want to leave anything out. But then at a certain point, collectively, and this is where the magic, right, that gut feeling comes into play of what makes you a good designer individually, is something's going to come together from all of those ideas on the board, because you started with a goal, right? Of like, I want to make a specific genre or a specific experience, and then that was the goal, and then you're coming up with all these features that make that special. And then the combination of those, that emergent gameplay that comes out of all those features, is really what makes your game unique. And so that vision is going to come, and that's when, if there is leadership, if there's like a creative director or a project lead or someone who is like, it was their ideal, right? Then it's going to start bubbling to the top. And so, you time box that of like, okay, we're going to spend an hour or 2 hours brainstorming what this is for a game jam. And then you just go to work on your A features, right? And someone is acting as producer, right? You may or may not have a producer, but someone is acting of like, okay, now that we have our A features, let's not even think about B and C. Those are officially dead until we finish A. And then you're going through and you're prioritizing those A features, because, it's very likely that you won't even get through all the A features if you didn't scope it properly. And so, I think that answers the question of, it's a process of first putting everything on the board, then prioritizing that board, then focusing in on one section of that board, and then actually like scheduling and time boxing it out of like, okay, can we even achieve what is in this column of A features? And if not, like, how far can we get, right? And that's your game.
I'm sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that brings me to another good point of as you're making those A features, right? As you're making the game, you're going to get to a point where that very well could change drastically, right? You can get to a point where this mechanic or this game design doc that you wrote 6 months ago that felt really good on paper and felt really good in your head is just not working out, right? Like, it's just not fun. Like the feature that it was dependent on wasn't executed the right way, or doesn't feel right once it is executed. And you might very well pivot and change what is the core game focus, what is the core mechanic that you're working on. And it's very important to realize that is okay, right? Like, being focused on your schedule and the features you want to accomplish is key, But there will be times when you just have to pivot and change, and you can't be emotionally attached to the game design doc you wrote at the beginning, right? Because a lot of things sound like they're going to work well together on paper, but then through the course of development, it just doesn't work out. And that is not an act of failure. That's an act of iteration, and that's where good games come out of, right? It's like there's a certain point where magic starts happening. And I will tell you, obviously video games, like all art, is subjective. But I will tell you that nearly every project I've ever been a part of is shitty for 90% of its development. Like, it is like not a fun experience. Like, the act of playing it, right? It's unbalanced. It's like it doesn't have the right flow, and then something magic happens in those midnight hours, leading up to launch, where you just do hit lists and you're just playing it every single day, and you're just slowly tweaking and polishing, and that is where the magic really happens. And that is why it's so important to make sure that you're scoping your A features appropriately enough that you have that time to polish and iterate on them, right? Because if you're still writing features, if you're still coding core gameplay and core mechanics all the way up until launch or the end of the game jam, you're gonna miss that magic hour of polishing all the really cool stuff and iterating on it to get it to a special point. You're just gonna get everything in, and getting everything in isn't as important as having at least a super polished core gameplay loop. And so that's where the master of the art comes in, of like having enough discipline to stop yourself from noodling, right? Because here's the problem. I noticed it a lot in art, especially with artists. Programmers are typically a bit better at this skill set, and designers are in the middle. But knowing when the changes you are making are only going to be noticed by you versus the player. You will always hit that. Like, artists never think they're done, right? They'll noodle on a rock kit for 6 months, even though 99% of players aren't going to realize the extra, 90% of work they put into it. And that's really where you have to listen to your other teams, right? You need to watch them play. You need to be doing play testing. And if you're having a play test and your fucking team is loving it and no one is pointing out, that the texture on a certain thing can be better, then leave it. It doesn't matter. It's not core to your gameplay. There are a lot of people out there who want to noodle and make everything pixel perfect, but pixel perfection does not make good games, right? It's the balance of everything being at that level that makes a good game. And you really need to focus on what is the core thing, right? And like a good example I use is in a racing game, when 90% of the gameplay is speeding past assets super quickly, you don't need to worry about making everything as photoreal as possible, right? Because 90% of the assets you're never even getting close to, and you're never seeing standing still. So if you're pulling tricks to, only building facades, only building trees that if you walked up to them would look terrible, but they look great in motion, then by all means do it. But if you're designing in a bubble and you're not thinking about that, and you're just thinking, oh, I'm making a tree, I need to make it as good as possible, then you're going to ruin it. When it comes to indie game development, I don't know if you guys have the resources to do this for your game jam, but you should rely on getting non-proprietary assets any way you can. I think, nowadays we are so fortunate to have things like the Unity Asset Store and the Unreal Marketplace and Turbo Squid and all these places where you can pull together resources that you shouldn't be wasting time on, right? Like, if your game isn't about walking through the forest, then go buy a fucking tree pack off Unity Asset Store and put it in your game. Because that is going to achieve, I need a forest over here in the distance, and I don't want to spend any amount of time making it. I just want to integrate it into my game build. You should do that. That way you can focus all of your energy on the proprietary assets that make your game unique, right? What is your main character? What is the core element, or whether it's a weapon or a vehicle or some aspect, that's where you need to be focusing your creative energy and time and resources and money, not in all these things that you just need the populated world to make it feel like a world. And so, you know, a lot of people get down on themselves, you know, maybe not so much in indie development, but in other words of like, they need to like spend X amount of time on every single asset in their game. And if you can buy it or get it for free or get it somewhere, then by all means do it. And here at Humble, we've recently had a lot of game making bundles, which are focused on that. And I'm building a few more now because I feel very strongly that the more assets we can get out there to people to use that are non-proprietary, the more amazing games we're going to see from developers of every caliber, because they can focus less on everybody remaking, you know, boxes and barrels and cars and vehicles, and instead put that energy towards making original gameplay. Yeah, that's a little bit of a tangent, but
no, that's fine. Yeah. I guess for the students here or newer, if you could, I don't know if you have any specific examples of maybe, you know, an A-class feature that looking back probably should have been a C-class, or a C-class you really looking back should have been an A-class. Any specific examples or anecdotal? You know, if there's anything, you know, I know not everything can be talked about, right? But, you know, if there's just anything that pops to your mind, because a lot of times, you know, we can talk about the A-class feature, but it may not be obvious what we're talking about. I don't know. Anything.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a good point. Man, let me.
That's fine.
Well, it's a good question. It's just like there's probably an infinite number of answers, and I want to find like a good, solid, meaty one. I will say, I don't know. I can't say that. So if you look at a franchise like Call of Duty, right? We spent 10, you know, now it's still going, over 10 years. I'm not doing it anymore, but over, 10 years making Call of Duty games. And you look at the evolution of that franchise, and really what you're looking at is us just going down our feature list of like, hey, we're going to take this first-person shooter out of the World War II era, and we're going to make an original modern combat game, modern warfare game. And over that course of time, we're adding in all of these features. And so at that core, right, look at like the first Modern Warfare game, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which is my personal favorite. And because it's just the essence, right? Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare is just the A features, right? It's like, oh, hey, we want to add in RPG elements to the multiplayer, so we're going to put in XP system and a progressive ranking, and now you unlock stuff, and we want to add a very basic perk system, but you can only have 3 perks, and that's like, we achieved our goal, right? The goal was, let's introduce RPG progressive ranking elements into a first-person shooter. And so we did that, and that the Class A feature of that was a 3-perk system, right? You can have 3 perks. They each have a slightly different attribute to your abilities. And we have a kill streak system, which as you chain kills successfully, you can call in 3 different kill streaks, right? That was a Class A feature. The Class B version of that was then the evolution of that thinking of like, okay, now we have this XP system. Now let's add in the ability to prestige so that there's infinite life to this progressive ranking system. Let's expand the perk ability. And now let's have pro perks where you can upgrade your perks. Let's have weapon progressive systems, right? Which came in Modern Warfare 3, I think we did. And so it's sort of like the Class A is what is the minimum we can do to achieve that goal. And then the Class C and B are, okay, now that that's in the game, what new feature are we able to do because that now exists, right? Like pro perks couldn't have existed without that Class A feature. Progressive weapon unlocks would not have existed without adding in progressive ranking systems. The entire, concept of a lot of the elements wouldn't have existed. A really good example, which is much bigger scale, is the introduction of Spec Ops mode, or co-op mode, right? Co-op mode was not a Class A feature for Call of Duty because at the time, the focus was a blockbuster single-player campaign and a repetitive multiplayer campaign, right? And I don't say repetitive as a negative thing. Like, if something's fine-tuned and addictive, then it's repetitive and good, and you always enjoy it. But co-op was not part of that because co-op did not achieve the core essence. But once you get big enough and you're advancing, that Class C feature moves up because you've already knocked out the Class A features, which were single-player, multiplayer, Class B features, which were a feature-rich, super deep multiplayer and single-player, and then you get the Class C, which is co-op, and then Class C expands into Class D, right, because the franchise has been going on forever, of like, oh, now we have missions and we have survival mode and we have all these others. Does that answer?
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I guess, do you want to open up the questions now? Is that?
Sure, yeah, that works for me.
Okay. All right, does anybody have any questions on the floor? Okay.
I do know there is some new people here, but there is some seniors here, and just asking a simple question. What are your recommendations, like a senior or even a freshman? What can we do during college to help us get into the industry?
Did you hear the question?
Your words.
Yeah. So what you can do now to increase your chances of getting into the game industry out of college, I mean, really what you're doing is the best thing, actually making content. Because the problem is, in any entertainment medium, right, whether it's film or it's music or video games, is there's a lot of people who have a lot of really good ideas. And I think we established earlier that that isn't enough, right? You can't just have a cool vision for what it will be. And even more so, even if you can expertly detail out how to achieve that vision, that still isn't enough. The best thing you can do is prove that you have the other skill set that is required, that you can motivate people around you or motivate yourself to actually take that vision and create something out of it. And even if it is just a 48-hour game jam, something tangible that you can ship and that people can play, they can load it up and they can run it as play, is the best thing you can have on your resume. And the good thing is that doesn't even need to be a complete game, right? Like if you're a programmer, then yeah, it should be some sort of prototype. But if you're not a programmer, if you're an artist or you're an animator or you're something else, then just be creating assets, right? And the great thing that, you know, most people didn't have 10 years ago or 5 years ago, where there's so many outlets to actually get that stuff out there and to monetize it. So you could be putting assets up on, you know, the Unity marketplace. You could be monetizing that stuff, getting it into games, or partnering with other developers and, you know, putting it in their games. There's so many opportunities to sort of just get stuff out there. And that is probably, you know, the best thing. There are other low-hanging fruit stuff that is just getting involved in the game industry now. And luckily, a lot of events are very open, right? Like right now in Los Angeles, IndieCade is going on this weekend, which is a conference just for indie developers. You should be going there because a lot of us in the industry go there to give talks, to meet with people, to see what new games are coming out. And it's a really good place to just network and get to know people. And then the talks are actually really good. They'll go into like very specific problem solvings of like, hey, we were making this game and we ran into this issue and here's how we solved it. Learning those firsthand accounts are essential to understanding like the realities of game development, because it's not like, I mean, we all know it's not easy, right? But like sometimes it's damn near impossible to get something out the door, and like learning firsthand how everybody else has put out their fires is super useful. So I would say step one is just start making anything that your skill set is focused on, whether that's at 3D assets or animations or, you know, artwork or prototypes, whatever it is, just start making stuff in any engine, right? It doesn't matter. And then step two is like actually once you have something to show, start getting involved in things like Indiecade and, you know, E3 is good, but that's much more of a marketing show. GDC, like you should be coming to GDC as soon as possible. And now there's GDCs, you know, nearly everywhere. Because what you're going to do is you're going to find people who need your skill set. There is an infinite number of indie studios or indie teams or big studios that have contract or freelance work that needs to be done. Yeah, so just start doing that, right? Like as soon as you can get on a project, even if it's an indie project that will have a small user base, like do it. And you can do that now, right? Like, and you'll be doing that, you know, super hardcore developers will do that their entire lives. Like, you know, I still work on indie games, even though my job here full-time during the day is being vice president of Humble. Like at night, I'm working on other projects. And so that's never going to stop. and like, if you really enjoy it, it should never stop. And there's no reason you shouldn't be doing that now that you're in school, right? Like work on your projects during the day and then at night, work on your other projects that you're going to try to monetize and release.
All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think I might be butchering his name. Edward McMullen. I can't remember his name. From Super Meat Boy.
Oh yeah.
I watched something he did. He was either on Indie Game the movie or something like that. He said that a game mechanic isn't really truly a good game mechanic unless, of course, you can find different ways to use that same game mechanic. He gave an example of the saws in Super Meat Boy, how you could throw them around in circles, they would go back and forth, you could shoot them at the player. Kind of like, what would your opinion on that would be? Do you agree, disagree?
I think it's good advice. I think it's generally true. And really what that is getting to the root of is that in game development, you need to leverage everything as many times as possible, right? Because what you don't have is you don't have the luxury to spend a lot of time making a feature or a mechanic that is only going to be seen or used once, right? The real trick is finding a mechanic that is used as many times as possible but never gets old. And Nintendo is the master of this, right? Like you play any Mario game and it's basically just a collection of very simple mechanics that are expertly paced out and used in a variety of ways. And that's why, you know, I love Super Mario Maker, because I feel like it's giving everybody a taste of like, yeah, anyone can make a level, right? You can load up Mario Maker and make a terrible level in minutes. But playing those terrible levels, you slowly start to realize the skill that it takes to make a good level out of simple mechanics. And that's really what Ed is touching on, is the fact that, like, yeah, if you boil down something like Super Meat Boy into its core mechanics, you could very easily be like, oh, that's a very simple game, right? And then people will take the word simple as like an insult. But what makes it good is the way you apply those simple mechanics in a variety of ways to make it an actual game. And so I think it's a very good point. And like that comes into that conversation of when you're prioritizing your features, what you're doing in that process is you're mentally looking at it and you're being like, okay, how is that being used? How often is it being used? And does that feature combined with the other features we already approved give the ability to create emergent gameplay? And that is like where you're seeing things like DayZ and Ark Survival Evolved and what are the other ones that, you know, people say are walking simulators because they're just big open worlds that have items that randomly spawn in them and you just kind of walk around and find them. But basically what that is doing is doing what we're talking about, which is creating a sandbox where you're just making mechanics, and instead of scripting those mechanics to happen in a certain flow, you're just dumping them into a world and relying entirely on emergent gameplay to be fun. And I think those games got so successful recently is because, you know, games like mine that I worked on were so focused on structuring the gameplay and making it where, like, no, we're going to tell you where to go. We're going to tell you how to have fun, and we're going to build the mechanics specifically for that experience, that it was really refreshing to have the opposite, right? Where it's like, oh, no, we're just going to throw a bunch of stuff in a world, and it's up to you to create the gameplay as a player. And so your job as a designer, right, you could take that approach, but your job as a designer and a developer is really to figure out, like, how can these things work together and let me make sure I'm giving the player the correct tools to create an infinite amount of fun.
Next question. Yeah, go ahead.
What was the first game you ever started on?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Oh, the first game you worked on.
The first game I worked on, like, professionally, as, like, they actually paid me to do it, was Call of Duty 2, which was our World War II entry into the Call of Duty franchise.
Yeah.
What are some things that they used to do, like in the what I consider the golden age of gaming, the 90s, that you think that should be brought back? Like, Nintendo had their collectathons for Donkey Kong and Banjo-Kazooie and stuff like that. We don't really see those much anymore. Do you think they still have a place? Old school mechanics, I'm saying, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think they do. I think they had a lot of benefits we don't have nowadays, in the fact that the market of, like, people making games was much smaller, right? So you could kind of just, like, own an area. But what I think the mistake we make nowadays is we don't give enough credit to our players. And this is more in AAA game development. Like, indie development does a really good job of, like, making truly difficult, challenging experiences that are meant to be played over and over again, the master. And that's really, like, you know, a lot of development is Kleenex development, right? And when I say Kleenex development in AAA, it's like, well, we really only want people to play this game for a year so that they will then buy the next one, right? And you didn't really get that feeling from older generations of game design, right? It was kind of like, hey, we understand that there are a mass market of people who may only play this game, right? Because of financial reasons or time commitments, or we're not even convinced that this video game industry thing will take off and people will spend hundreds of hours into it, or spend hundreds of millions of dollars in it. So they would make games that were literally timeless, right? It's like, you can play the same level over and over again, and you will, because we didn't have save features, and still enjoy it, right? And so I think taking a step back and feeling like you need to always be focused on accessibility, and that it's okay for the player to get frustrated sometimes, is good, as long as the game is good enough that they're willing to play through that frustration to master it. And that's what a lot of people had in older generations of games, of, like, they were completely fine pissing off the player. Like, they loved it, because when you did beat it, you actually felt a sense of achievement. And now we focus on, like, doling out achievement like they're candy. And we're like, oh yeah, like, oh, you beat the first level, here's you know, rewards. And we feel like we always have to, like, carrot the player, which may be true in free to play. It should not be true in a game that people pay money for out of the gate, right? Like, you've already bought the game, you don't need to carrot me along. Like, by all means, I love reward systems, but, like, make it a deep system, not this sort of, like, the illusion of an award system.
question. Olivia?
Yeah. What sort, I guess making games in general for a portfolio, would anything work out? Hang on. It's like, would anything work? And then we just replace old stuff with anything new. But is it better to have something in a portfolio than nothing? Sorry if that came out weird.
No, you should have as much diversity as possible in your portfolio, right? So it's like, as long as everything has purpose. So I'll give you a good example. We had this kid apply at Infinity Ward for a level design position. And I think he was 16 at the time. 16, 17 maybe. So he applied, and his portfolio was, he just modded a level in Call of Duty 4 maybe. He modded a level on PC, and in one level he had like 8 sections that were all completely different. So instead of making 8 different maps, he made one map that had 8 sections. So like as you're walking through, you enter a snow area, and then you're in a mountain range, and then you're in an urban environment that is all, and like each one had its own sort of little gameplay hook. So we actually hired that guy at 17, and like he ended up making a killing. He's a millionaire now. But all he did was make that one level. But the key to that one level was that it showed everything that he could do, right? He was a level designer. That was his skill set. And it showed that he could do any type of level. Where he could have made 8 separate maps, but by making 8 maps, the scope of each map would have been increased. And therefore, the quality of the amount of time he had to spend on each one would have been less.
Right.
Okay. And so the key there was that he was smart enough to know that it's more important that I show you a really polished variety than to just hit you with a ton of content that is all like mediocre. So, and the important thing is you can achieve that by modding their existing game and just adding in a new element, right? It could even be just re-scripting a level that's already designed into a cool new mission. It could be reskinning a game that you enjoy to show off like a new art style, or like, hey, I did this just to show you how this area would be better with like this lighting technique, right? So like, don't feel like you have to build everything from scratch. As long as you're very clear with like, hey, I started with this and I took it here to achieve this goal, like anything could be in your portfolio because you're not selling it, right? Like you're not like ripping somebody off. You're just using it as a stepping stone to show a specific thing that you're trying to achieve. And so I love when any of that stuff is in any portfolio. And the more I can see, the better. And it's also very clear to be able to, in your portfolio, openly articulate what you did and why you did it. The big mistake I see in a lot of portfolios is someone will send me a bunch of screenshots of a game, and I know that, 100 people worked on that game. How am I supposed to know what they did, and more importantly, why they did it, right? Because if you should send me a screenshot, I may look at whatever your title is, which could be misleading, and be like, oh, he must be responsible for this, and that's the worst thing in the screenshot, So you want to be able to call out like, oh, here's what I did, and here's why I did it, and here's the time I had to do it in, right? Because if you're showing me like an environment shot, and you're like, oh, I had like 2 weeks to work on the dressing props and 3 weeks to work on this, then I'm going to judge it accordingly and not expect it to look like it's a screenshot out of, The Division.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm here today with my son who is 9 years old, and he's just getting into this, and he's very interested in making this his career. And you were speaking of the 16-year-old that you guys hired. What do you suggest for really young people to break into the industry and then be taken seriously? Should we start traveling and going to conferences and networking once he feels like he has built up his skills?
It's a good question. I think what is the most? I want to give you something that's very actionable, like something he can like start doing tonight. I think some of the same advice from before still applies, right? Like he can still start creating things, and typically that starts off with like just modding existing things, getting involved in mod communities, games that you could alter the source files on, and honestly, I think a lot of it is just it really depends on what he wants to do, what his skill set is. But if it's very design focused, then a lot of it can just be getting involved in the very straightforward game engines, right? Things like RPG Maker, if he likes RPG games, or taking Unity and getting one of their prototype games, whether it's a shooter or racer or whatever it is, and like just start building stories out of it, is a good first step. And like really, not everybody does this, but typically all I care about is a portfolio. So I will have someone send me a portfolio without a resume and without a name and without anything else, because I want to see that and make a decision based on that before I even know who the person is or where they come from or where they worked before. And then from there, like if I like a portfolio, then I'll be like, okay, let me see the resume, and then let me meet this person, and then go from there. Luckily, none of that is age, gender, representation dependent, right? So there's no chance to be like, oh, like I don't like this aspect, right? I don't have any bias or prejudice towards this or that. It's really purely like, oh, what does the work look like? And a lot of that is like, what is the presentation of the work, right? And that is like, he should be getting involved in as many communities as he can of like, where people put up their portfolios, looking at how people present their work, and coming to conclusions on like what works and what doesn't, forming opinions on like why you should or should not present things a certain way. And then, another cool thing is if he has a lot of interest in it, is getting excited about reverse engineering what people are doing, right? Super Mario Maker is scratching the surface of that, right? Like playing other people's Mario levels and then like trying to figure out why they made the design decisions they made is scratching the surface. The next step of that is going through people's source codes, downloading moddable games, downloading assets from the Unity asset store, and looking at like, why did they sculpt it this way? Why are they doing their textures this way? Why are they doing, their normal masses? So whatever it is, like dissecting assets, dissecting levels, dissecting things, and trying to think about them in a very like clinical way of like, why did they make these decisions? And I think just getting in that thought process helps you come up with new ways, in ways that you would enjoy approaching them. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Got time for one or two more, I think. Yeah. Wait,
I do, but I'm still formulating it.
you're still formulating. Okay. Well, okay. Okay, we're going.
You were talking about story design. What's a good way to get started in story design if you've never tried it before? Like I've only done art, but I've never told stories with my art yet. I'm working on it though. Do you have any tips?
I think, a lot of it is just doing it. But the best way to go about doing it is finding a low effort way to test out new ideas, right? So it's like traditionally, if you wanted to be a writer, you would start with short stories. And you'd write a bunch of short stories because it allowed you to sort of figure out who you were as a writer. And you would get those in front of people and get feedback and see the reaction, whether it was anonymous or not. There are a lot of ways to do that in game design by, an exercise I like to do is like try to do a text adventure, right? I think, oh man, what there is, I can't remember the name of it, but there's several engines out there that are just about text adventures, and they're just focused on like multiple ending sort of stuff, right? So if you can get a free trial or license one of those and try to write a story around that, right? Because that is low barrier to entry. It doesn't require assets. It doesn't require technical skill. It just requires focusing on the narrative, and see if you can make compelling things out of that and get that in front of people. And that will help you learn like what works, what people respond to, what people don't respond to. Because the hard thing with writing for video games is you are not in control. You don't get to decide what people do. And so you need to make a good story that can stand on its own with people being crazy in the middle, right? Because otherwise, and this is a genre of game, you can just have a very linear experience, right? You can do the Telltale Games approach where you want them to go down a specific path, and maybe you'll give them, choices and arcs, but it's a very structured experience. Where most game design is not like that, right? It's like, yeah, you have key tentpole events that happens, and then what the player does in between is irrelevant because they're just having fun. And so, fan fiction is a good step. And all of this stuff are technically hobbies, but what they're doing is they're having you problem solve as you're doing that. That will then, when you take the leap into doing an original thing, you have already ran into a lot of the low-hanging fruit problems, and you already know how you're going to address them.
Another question?
Yeah, let me see if I can finish it as I'm saying it. For those of us that aren't really game devs, but still are gamers and enjoy games and the game culture and stuff, like I'm a web developer by trade, employee. How would someone who's like a systems engineer or something get into helping the game development community, like Humble Bundle did with getting games out there and getting assets out there and things like that? Is there really a strong place for that, or is that market kind of saturated now?
No, there's a more need for it nowadays than there was before, because now games are becoming a lot more accessible, and where you could focus your energy a lot is, you could focus it on distribution, right? Which is what Humble does, is like trying to get more games in front of more people. But then you could also look at it from an angle of accessibility, right? So like Asm.js is becoming very big. It has a lot of support by Google right now. It has a lot of support by Mozilla, and we're investing a lot in it too. And Asm is basically just games in the browser, right? But specifically targeted towards that extra layer of JavaScript. And there's a lot of advancements of people making games specifically for Asm right now. You could look at like, how can I assist in that, right? Like whether it's building a platform for those games to live on, or finding, learning ways to optimize that, because the big barrier to entry right now is playing a game in Asm in the browser. Is like, traditionally people think of browser games as like low quality, low bandwidth stuff, right? Like 2D, sprite-based, Flash games, stuff like that. But in reality, we're getting to a point where we could port AAA development into a browser. The only thing it requires is really smart engineering on the back end to break up what is loading and when it's loading, right? Like optimizing the streaming tech, optimizing when assets are delivered so that you could get those games into a browser. That's just throwing it out there. That's an area I'm really excited about right now that you could focus on. And then the rest is like, a lot of indie developers have a need because it's outside their core expertise, right? Like, developers should be focusing on developing the game. They should not be worrying about everything else involved with distributing, marketing, presenting, all of that. So web engineers have a lot of availability to come in and take that off their plate, to be like, okay, you make the game, you let me worry about the back end, right? Like, you could go into like how the matchmaking works, how the community works, how you're going to distribute it, how you're going to be sharing it, all of that. Like there's probably just as many routes you can take in game development from a website that you could as a developer on the game side.
Yeah, one more.
What's your favorite genre of game? What games do you like to play?
It's a good question. I think so. Legend of Zelda is my favorite franchise. So generally, I like adventure, open world. I like to focus on exploration, right? Like there's buckets of players, right? You have the completist who he just wants to see everything and say you got 100%. You have the killer who just wants to kill people and grief and he doesn't care about all the other features. I'm the explorer guy. I want to just experience it. Typically not do the main quests, right? Like I try to. So for example, I played Skyrim for 300 hours and didn't know there were dragons in it because I never did the quest where you fight the first dragon. And so I found out, which most people didn't know, that if you never kill that first dragon, if you avoid that quest, you can play the game forever and they never spawn dragons. So I would find shouts and I would find all this dragon related stuff and I was like, whatever. Like I'll just keep going because I didn't care about quests. I just liked coming up with some story of who I am in this universe and then just playing out that fantasy, right? Like, oh, I'm a thief and so I'm just going to go steal every item in the game and never do a quest. And so I think that's when I had the opportunity to do that in a game, which is in typically open world RPGs. I like that the most because I just kind of can do whatever I want for 10 minutes to 100 hours if I feel like it.
One more, maybe? So, Robert, I might finish up here real quick. So you're from Northern Kentucky originally. Is that right?
Yeah, Pioneer.
Pioneer, yeah, right. So, in high school and so on earlier, were you anticipating the game industry at all? Okay.
Yeah. So, I grew up in the middle of the country in Pioneer. I don't know if anybody knows where Pioneer is, but it's in between Louisville and Cincinnati, and it's the middle of nowhere. And my dad worked at the post office, and my mom didn't have a job. And so the concept of doing anything other than what my parents did was very foreign to me, right? Because I didn't even have the internet until, sophomore year in high school. And so, getting a computer my sophomore year of high school was very exciting for me because I got the internet and I got to get exposed to all this stuff that sounds super archaic nowadays, right? But the concept of like doing something like video games or working in entertainment or having your own company, all of this stuff did not exist to me, right? Like I thought you had to go work for someone, you had to go get a job because that's what my dad did and that's what he said you do because that's the process to making a living. So when I found out that you didn't have to do that you could literally just come up with an idea and try to achieve it. And the great thing is there's no limitation to trying. Anyone can try. And if you happen to successfully do it, then you get to do it again. And then you get to do it again. And so I like to say that you've never truly lived until you have overdrafted your bank account and made $1 million within a 24-hour period, which I have done several times in my life. And it's a ridiculous feeling that we live in a world where that is possible, that you could literally go from having nothing because you put it all into the stupid ideal that you had, and then you turn that stupid ideal into something that's real. And there's no limitation on where you live or what you do or who you are that stops you from doing that. The only thing that stops you from doing it is actually doing it. Because the biggest thing most people run into is they convince themselves that the obstacles are too big, right? It's like, oh, I can't do that because I don't know how to code, or I can't do that because someone already made that game, or I can't do that. And they'll come up with these reasons why they can't do it. And I have learned that 90% of those reasons are bullshit. Like, they're not real. Like, you convince yourself that they are, you know. Bigger than you like, just do it slightly different, right? Because through the act of trying to recreate that game, you're going to make decisions differently than they did that you never even realized, that creates a new genre, that creates a new element that people really latch onto. I don't remember what the question was, but
That's good. That was it. All right. I think we're good. We really appreciate your time and input, and yeah, this is cool. So we're gonna, thank you. I guess we're gonna start jamming here in just a second. So, all right.
So,
All right.
yeah, I'll just say, you know, like, my contact information's out there. So if anybody has any follow-up questions or concerns, or you want to share the games that you make during this game jam, I would love to see them.
All right, we will do that. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, take care.
Bye.
There you are.
Yes. It's horrifying. We know.